Warm greetings to one and all present here. It's been after a long that we are meeting on this platform for one more lecture. I, Dr. Shikha Dhiman, Assistant Professor, Department of Laws, Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar, will be enlightening you all on the topic Framing of Hypothesis. Let's begin with an introduction. Hypothesis is usually considered as an important mechanism in research. Hypothesis is a tentative assumption made in order to test its logical or empirical consequences. If we go by the origin of the word, it is derived from the Greek word hypotheniai, means to put under or to suppose. Etymologically, hypothesis is made up of two words, hypo and thesis, which means less than or less certain than a thesis. It is a presumptive statement of a proposition or a reasonable guess based on the available evidence which the researcher seeks to prove through his study. A hypothesis will give a plausible explanation that will be tested. A hypothesis may seem contrary to the real situation. It may prove to be correct or incorrect. Hypotheses need to be clear and precise and capable of being tested. It is to be limited in scope and consistent with known or established facts and should be amendable to testing within the stipulated time. It needs to explain what it claims to explain and what should have empirical reference. Generally, research is done on some formed presumptions. Once the problem is identified and formulated, literature is also reviewed and variables are also formed. Then comes the next step, that is to construct a hypothesis of your research problem. Hypothesis is considered as the basic tool in research. It is something which is to be tested or verified. If we do research without forming hypothesis, then there will be nothing to test or verify. That will just amount to collection of data and it cannot be called as research. A hypothesis, plural hypothesis, in a scientific context is a testable statement about the relationship between two or more than two variables or proposed explanation for some observed phenomenon. A simple hypothesis might predict a causal relationship between two variables, meaning that one has an effect on the other. Now, let us come to the meaning of hypothesis. A hypothesis can be defined as a tentative explanation of the research problem, a possible outcome of the research, or an educated guess about the research outcome, as stated by the scholars. Good and Hart have defined it as a proposition which can be put to test to determine its validity. Hypotheses are single tentative guesses, good hunches, assumed for use in devising theory or planning experiments intended to be given a direct experimental test when possible. According to Lundberg, a hypothesis is a tentative generalization, the validity of which remains to be tested. In its most elementary stage, the hypothesis may be any hunch, guess, imaginative idea, which become the basis for action or investigation. Hence, a hypothesis is a hunch, assumption, suspicion, assertion or an idea about a phenomenon or a relationship or a situation, the reality or truth of which the researcher does not know. A researcher calls these assumptions or hunches as hypotheses and they become the basis of an inquiry. In most studies, the hypothesis will be based upon your own or someone else's observation. Hypothesis brings clarity, specificity and focus to a research problem, but it is not essential for study. You can conduct a valid investigation sometimes even without constructing a formal hypothesis. The formulation of hypothesis provides a study with focus. It tells you what specific aspects of research problem to investigate. A hypothesis tells you what data to collect and what not to collect, thereby providing the focus of your study. As it provides a focus, the construction of hypothesis enhances the objectivity in a study. A hypothesis may enable you to add to the formulation of a theory. It also enables you to specifically conclude what is true and what is false. Lundberg observes, quite often a research hypothesis is a predictive statement capable of being tested by scientific methods that relates an independent variable to some dependent variable. In simple terms, hypothesis means a mere assumption or presumption or a supposition to be proved or disproved. It is a predictive statement made by the researcher that relates the different variables with one another. The word hypothesis is derived from two words, hypo, meaning tentative or anything subject to verification, and thesis, meaning a reasoned theory of balanced perspective. Also, hypo means less than and thesis means less than or less certain than a thesis. Hypothesis is not an idle speculation, but an opinion about real state of things worked under the strict supervision of reason and is constructed on the basis of problems and variables. It is suggested testable answer to a problem and is a testable relationship between two or more variables. Thus, if we have to proceed towards any destination of which we do not know the way, then we form an idea about the direction where to proceed by trial and error method in order to reach at our destination. Now, let us talk about the characteristics of hypothesis. Formulating a hypothesis is a tricky deal. Remember, there are various points that turn a proposition or supposition into well-written and researchable hypothesis. For example, a good hypothesis is always logical and affirmative. It is based on proper verification with clear yet precise statement offering balanced relationship between independent and dependent variables. It should be a guess for an observation, phenomenon or a problem that can be tested via research or experimentation following previous findings as well. The clarity of a good hypothesis could be judged according to previous studies if required. Cause and effect factor is also considered while writing a good hypothesis. It simply means that the hypothesis needs to propose that something will happen if something else is done. Sample hypothesis in this regard: children who are emotionally abused by their elders are more inclined to develop frustrated behaviors and feeling of rejection than children who are not. Kindergarten children who are praised and rewarded while collaborating with the instructor tend to be more prone to learning than their non-rewarded peers. In a nutshell, it is observed that one variable is supposed to affect the other variable in a well-written hypothesis. The features: number 1, should be capable of being tested and verified, means it should be possible to deduce logically certain inferences close to the level of concrete observation so that they can be tested by observation in the field. Number 2, should be closest to the things observable. Failing this would not be possible to test it with empirical facts. Number 3, should be conceptually precise and clear. Concepts to be clearly defined and not formally, otherwise it cannot be tested. If it will not be clear, then inferences drawn from it cannot be taken as reliable. Number 4, should be specific and limited in scope. Must be a narrow hypothesis that which could be easily tested. Should be related to the available techniques. Should be related to available technique means hypothesis should be formulated only after due thought has been given to the methods and techniques that can be used to measure the variables incorporated in hypothesis. Next, should be close-ended. Next, should state the variables relation. Next, should be non-contradictory one. Next, should be amenable to testing within the reasonable time, as one cannot spend a lifetime collecting the data to test the hypothesis. Another feature should be consistent with the most known facts, that is, it must be consistent with a substantial body of established facts. They should be grounded in a well-established theories and laws. However, hypothesis cannot be inconsistent with all known facts because in many areas a fact cannot contradict another fact. Next feature should be operationalizable, meaning that the hypothesis can be expressed in terms that can be measured. If it cannot be measured, it cannot be tested, and hence no conclusions can be drawn, which is the spirit of every research. It should have some empirical reference, that is, it means that it should have variables which can be put to empirical test, and they should not be merely be moral judgments. Now, there are different sources of hypothesis. Let's have an articulation upon that. A good hypothesis can only be derived from experience in research. Though hypothesis should precede the collection of data, but some degree of data collection, literature review or a pilot study will help in the development and gradual refinement of the hypothesis. A researcher should have the quality of an alert mind to derive a hypothesis and quality of critical mind of rejecting faulty hypotheses. The following sources can help the researcher in coming up with a good hypothesis. First, institution and personal experiences. Second, scientific theory, speculation, assumptions, propositions, suppositions. For example, you watch a movie and it was based on socio-economic problems. Then it becomes your source that you may get an idea. Another source is intuition. Next, observation, inspection, culture, civilization, social customs, values, traditions, analysis, scrutiny, some common circumstantial backgrounds, analogical reasoning, and there are certain commonalities between various things that lead to the formation of hypothesis. Another source is reviewing of available data and literature, discussion with other people. Many years of hard work and disciplined past research study is also one of the source. Folk wisdom researchers do form hypotheses from commonly held lay beliefs. Versatility of intelligence. Next is the types of hypothesis. There are various types of hypothesis. Few are mentioned as under. Number 1, descriptive hypothesis, which describes, gives an account of the characteristics of identified problem by closely observing what is what. For example, a country XYZ represses the creativity and motivation of its people. Working hypothesis. It is the preliminary assumption of the researcher about the research topic, particularly when sufficient literature is not available to construct the hypothesis. Working hypothesis is used to place the research problem in its right context and to reduce the research topic to an acceptable size. For example, in the field of a corporate law, researcher formulated the working hypothesis that liberalization policies in 90s lead to high tide of mergers and acquisitions in India. Later on, by collecting some more information and data, a researcher can modify his hypothesis and take a research hypothesis that liberalization policies of 90s lead to high tide of cross-border mergers and acquisitions in India. Another type of hypothesis is research hypothesis. It is based on some theory or researcher's proposition about some social fact. Researcher believes it to be true and wanted to prove it. Research hypothesis may be derived from theories or may result in developing of theories. For example, Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act has led to rise in number of sex selective abortions. Another type is null hypothesis. It means that there is zero or no relationship. It is the one which has no relation with variable, or there is no relation of variables among themselves. It is often written as H and is called H sub O. It is also called empty hypothesis, as it is of no scientific interest to the researcher. For example, if I have to formulate the null hypothesis, it can be role of Justice Krishna Iyer in human rights. Null hypothesis. Next type is relational hypothesis. It is the one in which variables have relation with one another. It explains now and why things are going on by showing us the interconnection between two or more variables. For example, if a country represses the creativity and motivation of its people, it will be economically underdeveloped. Another form is statistical hypothesis. In this, the things are reduced to measurable quantities and decisions are made about these quantities. It is on the basis of some statistical data. Another type is explanatory hypothesis. It explains the characteristics of the proposition. Next, universal hypothesis. It denotes that the stated relationship holds for all the specific variables for all the times and at all the places. For example, if I say, if brave soldiers are rewarded frequently for their better performance, they will perform better. Another type, alternate hypothesis. It is divided into two categories. One is directional hypothesis. It means the direction of the expected findings. Sometimes this type of hypothesis is formed to examine the relationship between variables rather than comparison between variables. What you have seen or survived, it gives you a direction to form some hypothesis. Another type is non-directional hypothesis. It is such which has to define direction of the expected findings being specified. When one constructs the hypothesis and it is so vague that towards which direction you have to go, it cannot be ascertained. Another type is univariable hypothesis and multivariable hypothesis. Univariable is the one which has only one variable, and multivariable hypothesis is the one which has more than one variables. Next, exploratory hypothesis. They go into the depth and width of research with various possibilities as far and visible. Now let us come to the nature of hypothesis. It is conceptual in nature and not vague, because the target should be very clear. It gives the verbal statement in declarative form. It has a future or forward reference. It is pivotal for research. It has empirical reference. It must be testable. If it is such thing that it does not require testing, then it means it is not a hypothesis. Now let us come to the importance of hypothesis. In various qualitative as well as quantitative studies, hypothesis is developed to talk about the research problem or to address any phenomenon. It aims to encourage critical approach. It enables the researcher to develop a specific direction as well as a better understanding about the subject matter of study. It further assists in the careful and focused analysis of data collection. There are different types of hypotheses. The two that are more basic involve those used in scientific researches and the other one in the sociological studies. In scientific researches, hypotheses are developed keeping in mind the experimentation and observation drawn from the past. Such hypotheses are tested according to the current theories. Science fair projects involve these forms of hypotheses. Let's say, for example, if water temperature rises, then sugar or salt will be dissolved at a higher rate. On the other hand, working hypotheses are based on the widely accepted suppositions in order to carry out further research. For example, if I start the consumption of more vegetables and fruits, then I will be prone to faster weight loss, or if I start adding pesticides to the growth of my plants, then these will grow faster and safer. Few importance of hypothesis is mentioned as under. Number 1, provides direction to the research and defines what is relevant and what is irrelevant. Thus, it prevents review of irrelevant literature and collection. Number 2, it prevents blind research and indiscriminate gathering of data which may later prove irrelevant to the research problem. 3, it makes research inquiry more specific. 4, it is the starting point of research. 5th, it helps in deciding the direction where to proceed. 6th, it gives microscopic target on the point. 7th, in absence of hypothesis, research is like a sailor on a wide sea without compass. 8th, it serves as a framework for drawing out the conclusion in a meaningful way, makes possible the interpretation of data in the light of tentative proposition or provisional guess. 9th, hypothesis is important as a tool of inquiry or research because they are derived from a theory or they lead to a theory. Research problem cannot be itself scientifically solved because the problem is a question of broad nature and it cannot be directly testable. One does not test the question itself, rather test the relationship between the variables. Now, there are different steps that is required for the formulation of a hypothesis. Step 1, observation. Researcher has to first of all observe the phenomena. Number 2, reflection. It should identify the reflection, that is cause and consequence of the phenomena. Thirdly, deduction or induction. Logically deduct the fact relating to the phenomena. Fourthly, verification. Should keep it ready for verification with the empirical situations. Now, after this we have difficulties in formulating the hypothesis. What difficulties we come across? Insufficient review of literature, lack of training, like how to identify the variables. Next, identified problem is vague. For example, role of narco-analysis in crime investigation, some reflections. It looks so vague. Ambiguity in thoughts, availability of wrong data, time constraints, absence of clear theoretical framework, lack of ability to utilize that theoretical framework logically, failure to be acquainted with available research techniques so as to be able to phrase the hypothesis properly. Now, there are different types of errors while testing the hypothesis. there are basically two types of errors we make in the context of testing of hypothesis. These are known as type 1 error and type 2 error. In type 1 error, we may reject null hypothesis when null hypothesis is true. Type 2 error is when we accept null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is not true. In other words, type 1 error means rejection of hypothesis which should have been accepted, and type 2 error means accepting the hypothesis which should have been rejected. Type 1 error is denoted by alpha, known as alpha error, also called the level of significance of test, and type 2 error is denoted by beta, known as beta error. The probability of type 1 error is usually determined in advance and is understood as the level of significance of testing the hypothesis. If type 1 error is fixed at 5%, it means that there are about 5 chances in 100 that we will reject null hypothesis when null hypothesis is true. We can control type 1 error just by fixing at a lower level. For instance, if we fix it at 1%, we will say that the maximum probability of committing type 1 error would be only 0.01. But with the fixed sample size, when we try to reduce type 1 error, the probability of committing type 2 error increases. Both types of errors cannot be reduced simultaneously. There is trade-off between two types of errors, which means that the probability of making one type error can only be reduced if we are willing to increase the probability of making the other type of error. One must set a very high level of type 1 error in one's testing technique of a given hypothesis. Hence, in the testing of hypothesis, one must make all possible efforts to strike an adequate balance between type 1 and type 2 errors. Let's conclude the topic. A research hypothesis serves as a guide for scientists. It is a tested idea that applies across different fields, including medicine, social sciences, and natural sciences. Integrating theories with hands-on information assists the researchers in exploring and discovering the new information. Decode is a valuable tool for researchers. It simplifies creating surveys, gathering data, and analyzing the information. It supports all types of research from forming hypotheses to testing them. Thank you everyone for your time and attention. I also appreciate the opportunity to speak and share my views with you today. Thanks once again. Take care. God bless you all.